I'm Benjamen Simon, finishing a PhD, and back in April, I started a data science consultancy called New Frontiers AI, or NFAI. And this came about because I work in an environment, a sort of shared co-working space, surrounded by different solo entrepreneurs and startups, especially in the tech space. And I got an insight into what it means to enter into the world of startups. And mostly they weren't, college geniuses or people who have been running their own businesses for 15 years. Mostly it was regular people who just decided to take a risk on themselves and go out and do it. There's ex-police officers who are now multimillionaires. There's people who picked up a bit of consulting work during PhDs and turned it into a business. There's people who did a master's and then were just like, I never want to work for someone. I want to do my own thing. And it's really inspiring. And at the same time, I got to see that no matter whether they were an advertising company or health tech, or even in some cases sort of very computer and software based, none of them really had any idea about data or data analytics or data science. Most didn't know vernacular. The best they could do would be to know that this was something that was changing the world, and to know that they had the potential to do something with it. They knew they had data, or they knew they had an idea of what, if they had the right data, they could do something with it. For instance, maybe they could predict which customers are more likely to convert, or maybe they could predict which patients have the most chance of success at treatment and could prioritize making sure that happened for them. But they had no idea how to do that. And to be honest, I saw a lot of things. I saw a lack of information. I saw fear in many parts. And I saw just not prioritization, because they knew how to do other things that they knew would get them a return on investment. And this seemed more like a pipe dream. Whereas to me, I looked at it and I went, well, this is more than possible. This is almost pretty much exactly what the field is about. And so I started this company with the vision of helping these startups take their first steps on the data science journey. And that kind of just opened up a can of worms. And for me, I'm always someone who digs deep down, whether it be, in my organization of life or my mental health or my business. I'm always trying to dig down to the deepest level and fix that sort of core problem, so that everything else sort of cascades from that, and there's a lot less work to do overall. And so I kept talking to these startups, and I kept finding that there were lots of questions that arise about, in this environment, how do you actually engage in the data science or data analytics process? And so that led me to this data strategy element. So this is a talk in the sense that I am going to present you with some ideas, some pennies for thought, some things to ruminate on. But I actually also want it to be a discussion forum. So I'm going to talk for 20, 25 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up. And I'd like to hear from you guys to talk about the points that I've discussed, any thoughts you've had along the way, any thoughts you feel like you can contribute to, because this is still a very young field. And from a lot of the people that I've talked to, never mind not defining well what startup is or what a data strategy is or what direction you should go in, but generally just like even who is responsible for these things, or who is capable of doing these things, or the ideas that can be brought into it. And I've talked to people from lots of different fields as well, not just data, especially in software, which is a lot more developed. There's a lot of ideas there that have already solved sort of tangential problems to this that can be brought in. And so at the end of this, I'd love to open this up and just talk it through and see if we can take our knowledge on this a bit further by crowdsourcing. So starting with some definitions, just so that we're all on the same page. The way I think about data strategy is sort of the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how of incorporating the use of data into a business or an organization. So if we think about the who, that's who's responsible for it, who's going to do it, who's creating the strategy. The what is obviously what are you doing? Why, I think, is really sort of at the core of a data strategy and what sort of separates it from all the other pillars of data within an organization, which is why are we doing the things that we are doing? What are the goals? Why is this the approach we are taking? Why is this important? And again, sort of going back to what are we trying to achieve using data, and is it necessary? Because while as data professionals, I think we'd all probably fall into the field of this is the oil and the electricity of the 21st century. This is what's going to propel us into the future. Not everyone thinks that way, and it's not necessarily true in every case. As a person who models epidemics, I am someone who comes into the pandemic environment going, yes, this gold standard methodology for modeling the epidemic, this is what's going to solve it. But when it came down to reality, and I worked a bit for the government and I actually applied this in reality, it's a pillar of it, but it's not absolutely necessary. There were much simpler methods. There was a whole thing about which decisions from a monetary point of view or a government point of view or a general well-being point of view had to be made. And it's not always as simple as optimize the model and then follow what the model says. And similarly, companies can't always just prioritize the data element of the business. And so that comes into the data strategy as well. Is it the right choice? So it's all these things, it's all these questions essentially that set you up for moving forward. And while every business typically has a business strategy, whether it's a good one or not, they have it. I mean, I've done basic entrepreneurship training, and having my table of 15 boxes or whatever it is and making sure they're filled out with all the different elements is basically the first thing that you do with an idea. But almost no one knows what a data strategy is. And then there's the question of, well, what is a startup? And I typically at the moment am dividing startups into two categories. There's startups that have money and there's startups that don't have money. Both are very valid, and both kind of need a different data strategy and different considerations for the fact that they have different amounts of money. And a startup isn't necessarily someone with venture capital funding, though that's great. They could be bootstrapped. But even if they don't have money yet, as I said, it could just be an idea. But at the other end of the spectrum, it might not be what we traditionally think of as a startup. Because so many companies don't have any data infrastructure, aren't data literate, haven't really taken their first steps on their data journey. Even if they're a well-established company, perhaps even with millions and millions of dollars, they might be, for the sake of data strategy, be considered a startup with a lot of money. For instance, there was a period where I was discussing working with a sort of tech-focused bank. They were quite young. They mostly targeted high-risk companies or high-risk consumers, as that was sort of like their speciality. And they wanted to take their first steps into becoming a data-driven organization. And as established a company as they were, and it introduced new challenges, especially in the banking sector where people are a bit distrusting of technology, it was essentially that they were a startup wanting to take their first steps in data, and what can they do and how are they going to do it. So there's that to consider. And so with that set up, I want to talk about many of the thoughts I've been having since starting this company around what is data strategy for startups, because I am my core, I'm a data scientist, and I started with this vision of I'm going to go to a company, I'm going to take their idea, I'm going to turn it into a data science product, and I'm going to hand it back to them, and they're going to go get money from using it, or they're going to go get investment. And that's going to set them off as their first step on their journey. And then it's going to create this symbiotic relationship where then they can come back to me with more ideas and more money, and we can keep developing it together until I can sort of hand them off and help them, start their own sort of data division, and they don't need me so much anymore. Because I really want to empower companies to take their first step on this data journey so that they can harness that power that we talked about. But I quickly realized that I was experiencing something very similar from when I teach swing dancing. So I'm a swing dancer. I've been swing dancing for about 5 years or so. After about year 1 or 2, I started leading the organization. I picked up teaching and I passed on my knowledge. And I realized that there's two very distinct ways that I can do this. Swing dancing is a partner dance. It's all improvised, and we mainly have a focus on fun. But there's obviously a right way to do it. It's not one singular way to do it, but like safe ways and ways that best communicate what you want to do and make you a better dancer and so forth. And when 100 new students would come into my classroom at the beginning of an academic year, I had a choice. I could either teach them in a highly technical way, make sure they were doing everything right from the beginning. Sorry, that's right. I could make sure they were doing everything right from the beginning. And it would mean that they didn't pick up bad habits. It would mean that they weren't likely to get hurt or to hurt anyone. And that after the 3 to 6 month investment of time and energy and a bit of money, they were going to be in a really good position. They were going to have solid foundations. They were going to be pretty decent dancers, and they were going to be well on their way to becoming really good dancers. But I knew from experience that not everyone was wired that way. And if I did that, then I was probably going to end up with only a handful of people, 2 or 3 out of the 100 that had come into my classroom, who actually wanted to stick around. On the other hand, I could focus on fun. I could focus on making sure that people were engaged and enjoying themselves and coming to the next lesson and kept on investing their time. And if that happened, I might be able to retain 60 or 70% based on previous experience. This is another note that you're never going to get to keep everyone, and there's always going to be some people who aren't ready to take these steps. But if I kept those 60, 70%, then they're going to pick up bad habits, all different kinds of bad habits. They might end up hurting themselves because they're not holding their body in the correct way. They might not be sending signals very well, which means that they're not really progressing very well. They might end up doing something wrong and hurting someone else. But they would be sticking around. And if we built up that passion over the next 6 months, then I could go back to them and go, all right, and now we're going to fix some things. And it's a slower process, but it might mean that more people stick around. And it's similar with data strategy. I can go into a business, and from the fun example, I can go in, they can give me an idea, I can hash together a data product, I can maybe get a software engineer to build some structure around that if I need it. We wouldn't really have any data engineering capacity. We would have exactly what we needed for that product. It would be essentially like I was building it on my own computer for something that I wanted to put up on my GitHub. But that's not useless. Like, they can still take that to investors. They can still put that in front of customers. And only when it was necessary would they scale it up again. But this could develop bad habits. This could become every data product. And 3 or 4 years down the line, that's just, maybe even earlier, that's just going to collapse in on itself. At the other end of the spectrum, I could go from the beginning, well, you need a data strategy. You need a 3-year plan. You need to know exactly why you're doing what you're doing, who's responsible, what you're going to do with it. You need to have data engineering infrastructure. You need to start with analytics, don't even worry about data science yet, and so forth. And a year and a half into the process, then we can start looking at applying data science and coming up with product ideas. And that's going to set them up really well for the future. If done right, that's going to lead to the best long-term return on investment guaranteed. And it's the safest way, in a sense, to do it, providing they have the capital and providing that they have trust in the process and providing that they have the passion to see that through in the long run, knowing that it's going to take a long time for those gains to start building up. And the number of companies that we're going to find who are startups who are capable and willing to do that are very, very few. And that's not really the vision of my company. The company isn't to take the people who really want to do it and only focus on them. It's to empower as many people as possible. And so then that's the first dilemma you end up in, is how do you actually help these companies? And then, so what does data strategy look like for a startup when you have all these caveats? And coming into data strategy is all of these considerations. We have the infrastructure of how are we going to store our data? How are we going to access our data? How are we going to, visualize and explore our data? And how are we going to turn that data into data products using data science? we've got what are the goals of the company? What are they trying to achieve? Are they just trying to get a lot of money? Are they trying to find a better way of helping their clients? Are they trying to become an industry leader? And then that's their overall goals. What about the low level goals? So do they want a product by the end of next quarter? Do they just want to know what the story is with their data? Do they want to be able to increase their profits by 10% using data? What return on investment are they looking for? Are they looking for something extreme, like they want to invest 10,000 now and get 200,000 back by the end of the year because they know the power of AI and they've heard these stories? Or are they looking to just increase their bottom line by 30% by introducing good data practices? What do they actually need? And then how are they going to measure it? How are they going to measure if anything that they introduce is actually effective at what they want to do? Because data strategy isn't just create the product, it's the whole ethos around what a company does with its data. Now, I could come in and I could build some machine learning model which predicts a certain thing, which they can stick in the end of their app or something, and that's very useful. But equally useful is having a culture within your company where every person feels responsible for data. The best example I've ever heard of a story of a data-driven company is one based in the UK called the Modern Milkman. They basically modernized the milk run where someone would drop milk at your house every morning, you pick it up off your doorstep, and they expanded that to groceries. And in that company, every single person, whether it's the finance department, whether it's HR, whether it's leadership, everyone has a data-first mindset. In whatever they do, they review the data related to what they're thinking about. And the organization doesn't work where some data scientists or data analysts come into a boardroom each week with a charts and explain to someone. It doesn't even work where they necessarily shove dashboards in front of people and expect them to use them. Everyone has a data literacy and they think about the questions they want and they explore. And then the data specialists take that then further by working with all the teams. And having that sort of attitude allows the company to utilize its data far more powerfully than a siloed data team. And so this is a question of whose responsibility is it to use the data? Whose responsibility is it to manage these models and build these models? And especially in a startup where you have limited resources, whether it be in capital, whether it be in person hours to actually do the work, whether it be in technical expertise, whether it be in technical infrastructure. And, and at what point do you stop outsourcing that to, say, someone like me in a consultancy and start building your own team? When do you outsource building your data strategy to someone like me? That's my vision for the future, is being a for hire data strategist, and then start bringing that in-house so that that can grow and develop with the business. And within the data field, we have this question of the different pillars of data. We've got the data engineering, who build the infrastructure and get all the data in a nice place so that data analysts and data scientists can do something with it that's going to help the business. And I don't think these two things are follow on from each other. I think they both start at the same place and end at different points. Both take data and they process it and they clean it. And then what they do in the end has a different purpose. Data analysts look for stories within the data and tell you what it's saying and build dashboards to visualize that and help inform the people within the company. I typically define data scientists primarily as building data products, whether that be models, whether that be AI systems. And though there's a lot of overlap and there's modeling in data analytics and there's analytics in data science, this is how I like to think about it. And there's a question of what does the company need? And can you do one without the other? Can you skip parts? What do you necessarily prioritize? Which leads us to the question of where do we start? Now, I had this example of the two extremes of, do we do everything right from the beginning, but very few people are going to sign up to that? Or do we do things very hacky, but not many people, but lots of people are going to get on board and we can hopefully build lots of momentum for them and then they can fix it later. And something in between that is having knowledge of everything that you should be doing right a big list that makes you consider everything that would be the best, everything that you should be looking into, and everything that would be the best way to do it. And reviewing that once a month while pursuing yourself down this data journey. And every month going, what are we doing right? What are we doing hacky? And what is necessary to be doing right in this moment? And what can we get away with? For instance, if we're taking this first step, do we need a Snowflake environment? Do we need an AWS server? Or can we get away with a couple of Excel files, meticulously managed on a hard drive that people have access to? Because for now, we don't have the data and we don't have the proof of concept necessary to actually need an AWS instance. Instead, we can just build it on a local machine and we can just get it going for now. And when it comes to the point where we need to scale up, then we can introduce that. And this is one possible way of doing it. And it's one that I really like because it keeps the data strategy in mind. It keeps in mind that you need to be considering all of these important facets because you don't want to 3 years down the line end up having wasted a load of money. But it acknowledges that all of it is not possible or necessary right at the beginning. Now, I've heard a lot of stories through conversations that I've had a lot over the past few months from people in all different sectors of companies that, without a data strategy, whether they're big or small, have gotten to a point where no matter how much time, money, and energy and people they've invested into data and data science and data analytics, it hasn't paid off, and more often it's blown up in their face. There was a very large clothes manufacturing company who you probably heard of, who I talked to someone who was leading their data organization who just got fired because they just canceled, they just got rid of their entire data departments because after 3 years, it hadn't had an impact because there wasn't buy-in from the C-suite. Their data departments didn't have agency, and they were building lots of little proof of concepts, which were interesting, but they never got turned into products that actually made a difference for the company. So 3 years down the line, it was just a load of wasted money. Another one I heard about was a startup in the solar engineering space who basically didn't trust their data department. And so the data department didn't have any power to actually do anything or inform any decisions. And it led to their marketing department essentially not predicting that solar sales would have a severe drop-off in winter, which led to a huge economic downturn within the company itself. And so this is why it's so important to get the data strategy right for the startup. And it's so important, why it's so important to me to really deep dive into what a startup, to really deep dive into what a data strategy is for a startup and what all the considerations are and how to do it right for the environment that they're existing in. So at this point, I want to open up this call into more of a discussion forum. And I'm sure you all have your own unique experiences, whether you've worked in the industry before, whether you've worked as a consultant, even if you're just a student and what you've learned there and how you think about data science at the moment. It's all useful insights into us figuring out together what data strategy looks like for startups. Because I've also talked to data veterans in the space, the people who are leading these companies in data strategy. And another point that comes out is that there's simply just not enough people doing data strategy. And really, there's not really anyone, the word qualified isn't quite right. But essentially, unlike in other more established vocations around the world, say accounting or HR, they all have a governing body, some organization, sometimes that gives them special titles and things like that to give them more merit. which keeps an eye on what's happening in the world within their field and is continuously researching it and is continuously feeding back to them what the gold standard is, what the best practices are, so that they can take that away and take that back into their company and say, hey, this is how it's being done these days. This is what's considered the best. We should do this in our company. And sometimes companies, when they get big investment, they go, okay, we can make our company better now. They say to all the heads of departments, go away to your organizations, find out what's the best thing that's being done, and come back and implement that. And the accounting department goes off, the HR department goes off. And what happens is the data department is they just go into a little huddle and they just start discussing what the best programming language to use is and how they're going to store their matrices, because there isn't this organization necessarily for data science. At the same time, the data scientists themselves aren't necessarily moving up the ranks and becoming data leadership, because pure data scientists, people who got into it to build the model and build the AI, they, as a general I've heard from people, don't necessarily want to become a leader and stop doing the fun stuff that they signed up for. They want to keep hacking away and doing interesting modeling stuff, which leaves leadership to either people with MBAs, but not necessarily the technical background to understand the nuances of data science and data analytics, or people who have moved across some other tech fields like software engineering, which is, again, has its own advantages, but again, don't necessarily understand the nuances that separate data from software engineering and other computer science disciplines. And so there is a need for people with a strong data background to move into this space of data leadership. And so it's not necessary, at the moment what's happening is it's people with 10, 15 years experience in the field eventually making their way into that space. But that's not necessarily necessary in my head. I think if you can crowdsource the right information, read the right books, practice with the right clients, with their acceptance that this is a learning process for everyone, you can fast track that process over 2 or 3 years and become someone whose speciality is data strategy. So now, even though I said it 5 minutes ago, I want to open up this call. That's the end of what I wanted to say surrounding my thoughts for now, and just hear if there's anything from what I've said so far that's piqued your interest and that you want to contribute to, or just what, in your experience of companies or data science, this process might look like to you.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start talking. That was an awesome presentation. I really liked kind of how you frame things and your approach to data strategy. It's not something that I've given a whole lot of thought to. But like hearing you talk about it gives me a lot of clarity. I especially like how you kind of frame it as like there are these two general approaches. Like you can get everything right, or you can do it the hacky way. And typically the optimal data strategy for a particular business is somewhere in the middle. And so I would imagine for a lot of startups, you know, the ones that have money versus the ones that don't have money, I feel like there's going to be, you know, it's going to lean toward hacky as opposed to everything right, I guess, depending on the industry. Kind of based on your experience and in that, you know, that co-working space with all those small businesses that you were working with, what was your kind of experience and impression of like where people landed on the spectrum?
I mean, I had exactly the same thoughts as you. I mean, I thought I keep my prices reasonable because I'm new to the game and I want to build up a reputation, but it's still expensive. Like we are a highly specialized individual doing something that these people have no idea what to do that could earn them a lot of money. And so there's already an investment just asking any one of us to do something with what they have. And if they don't have that much money or they don't have any money, in my head, it was like, how can I ask this person to invest a couple of $100 or a couple of $1,000 even in basic infrastructure so that they're, you know, moving with the right foot forward? But when I talk to people, because there is so little knowledge about it, there is this openness that I'm coming as an expert, and if I go, like, it is possible to do it this way, but I'm going to be honest with you, you want to be, at least setting up your data in a proper server, or you want to be developing things on AWS or a Google, whatever, Google Cloud, they trust that. And their question isn't like, oh no, like this is already too expensive to me. It's a question of, well, get me numbers. Like I'm willing to consider that, but I need to know how much it costs. I need to have a good vision of like what I'm investing and what can I expect my return on investment to be. Now the return on investment, that's kind of more on their side. That's sort of them knowing, if I build this product, how many customers can I buy it? Can I get to buy it? What can I sell it for? What's it going to be worth to people? But the cost side, that's on us, because they have no idea what they need and they have no idea how much it costs.
Yeah.
And so this is the interesting thing that I found, where I assumed they would go, no way, and I would have to build something hacky to get their enthusiasm up. But really, every company is different. But even those that aren't that rich and are bootstrapped are willing to consider doing it properly. And then I think it does come down to us and this is why I like this middle ground approach, to go, well, do they actually need that, right? Can I just build them this hacky thing that they can put in front of their customers, and then when they've got 50 signups, go, all right, this is going to be a bit much. We need to get you a server. At the same time, I've spoken to people who are very much at the beginning and have no money and are trying to go the like get funding for an idea kind of route. And they are really enthusiastic to hear what is the proper way of doing it. Now, whether they choose to do that in the end, because they're going to have to prioritize certain things, is another question. But they don't go into it going, okay, I've got this idea for this app, from a data perspective, what do I need? They don't want to hear, well, we could get away with building you a Python script and then you've just got to run that on the back end of whatever. They really want to hear like, okay, well, best practices is either to get AWS or Google Cloud. I recommend X, Y, and Z. Your costs are looking for probably this much for a month. That can scale once you get to X size. And, really like in terms of people you want to hire, like you really want, like I could do this and maybe subcontract someone to build this little bit for me. But, maybe you actually want to start with just a data engineer and make sure that's solidly defined. And then when you're 6 months into a working product, then you come back to me and we talk about, what are you going to use analytics for and stuff like that. And so there's a lot of considerations, obviously, when you've got nothing, where do you go? And they're really interested to hear it all. And I've not been in the game long enough to, I'd imagine 2 years would be a nice amount of time to look back on people and go, okay, what decisions did they make and what did they prioritize? Hopefully some conversations will help me figure that out with some other people. But I had the same sort of view of they're not going to go for this, but really they're more open than one would expect.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and that kind of makes sense based on what you're saying. If someone's trying to get VC funding, if they're like, "Hey, we got this cool thing that runs on my laptop and this like janky Python script that I wrote, and I'm not a software developer," it's going to be harder to get seed funding if as opposed to like, "Hey, yeah, we got this like data infrastructure set up. We got database on Snowflake. We're automating everything with AWS and." You can interact with the product through this like web portal and all that kind of stuff. So that makes a lot of sense. To kind of give a bit color to kind of the conversation, hopefully I can share like my experience working at Toyota, because I was in Toyota Financial Services, which is essentially the arm of Toyota that sells money so people can actually afford the cars. And we were, I had joined a rapidly growing data and analytics group, and I was on the data science team of that kind of larger organization. And, data strategy, plays a big role here because, one of the big challenges, as you were alluding to, it's like, okay, how do you find the leadership for this organization? Like, it's one thing to be a startup and your data science and analytics team is 3 people, but when your data science and analytics team is 600 people or 1,000 people, you need to have the right leaders in place to kind of steer that organization. So that's definitely a big challenge. And I think we kind of got lucky at Toyota in that, he was the current chief analytics officer, statistics PhD, the VP of data science and analytics, who I eventually would report up to, statistics PhD, the kind of lead, most senior person in the data science group, PhD, statistics PhD. So they were all technical, but they were all, they had the desire to be a data leader, because again, like a lot of people, they get to a certain point and they're like, I don't want to be a manager. I just want to, I want to keep doing the technical stuff, the stuff that I like to do, like solving problems and providing value, not necessarily like managing a team. So like finding the people that want to do both is a big challenge. And I can see it at a lot of other organizations, but the other big challenge is getting buy-in from the business. And so like that's relevant on a small scale, but also, like me as a data scientist going to a stakeholder, like kind of getting their buy-in for some way to approach a problem or to build something for them that I think would be helpful to them, or do something in a certain way that I think would be optimal. But also on like a larger organizational scale, where it's the data science group or the data and analytics organization needs to get buy-in from an adjacent organization, which is like the risk team in financial services, or like the marketing team in like any business, or the sales team. So it's interesting to think about that. It's not something I really have thought about before. I don't know, Ben, do you have any like reactions on to this rant that I'm going on right now?
Yeah, it's reminding me one interesting thing that I've noticed in the clients that I've been talking to is the ones who are bootstrapped and have a bit of money and are established maybe a couple of years down the road, but still considered small, really. They have the ideas they want to turn into reality, and so they have some things in place, and it's usually a weird mismatch. One had like a data infrastructure in place, but had no idea about data science. Another had like a solid set of software engineering contractors that like were almost employees essentially, who built everything for them. And so in those cases, I could come in and basically go, well, I can build you a model or whatever it is that they wanted. And then what would happen is they'd integrate that in their backend or into their app or into their product on their own, using their own software engineers. And in which case, they, as much as they appreciated they didn't know much about data or anything about data scientists or what they can do with it, they assumed that their clients and customers and people who potentially give them funding knew even less. And so they were okay in a sense of, as long as they understand it enough from me that they can sound smart when they describe it to someone else,
yeah,
that was more than enough. And your point about stakeholders comes back around to it, because for me, when I was thinking of names for my company, one central element that was in the first idea batch was the idea of empathy. Because I think that what sets us apart as the strongest data scientists, if you're not building some super high profile AI that's going to revolutionize AI, is for day-to-day data scientists, is the ability to empathize with and communicate with people who have absolutely no idea what you're doing or how you're doing it, or what even the purpose is. And so being able to explain to people in intuitive terms these complicated things, how it helps them, what the steps are, and why these elements about why it's not guaranteed that it's going to work, or why we should really be trying 20 different ideas first rather than just choosing one that sounds really interesting or really like it's going to work, or what have you, because there's inherent risk in any data science project. And so being able to communicate with these stakeholders, whether they're your clients who you're building the product for, or empowering them to be able to speak to their clients or funders so that they can sell your product to the people they want to, I see as one of the most important aspects of what we do. And certainly having data strategy forms a pillar of data strategy. Is that element to me, is making sure that the buy-in is not something that the data scientist is fighting for each time, but is the culture itself of the organization.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it kind of, I really like what you said about empathy. I know we're kind of running low on time here, and I also want to get Aamir's perspective because he does IT audit, so he's seeing the data infrastructure of a lot of different types of companies. So I'm really curious about his perspective on this. But I'll just say, communication is something that I've given a lot of attention to and have really tried to develop over the past several years. And one of the best communicators I met at Toyota, he said the key to effective communication is knowing your audience. And to me, my translation of that is empathy. So I feel like you and I are really aligned on that perspective. But Aamir, what do you typically see in the clients that you work with? What does their data infrastructure look like? Do you get a glimpse of their data strategy as Ben has defined it? And what does that landscape typically look like?
So, hi Benjamin, I'm Aamir. Very nice presentation. I was actually very excited to hear this one, so I'm a little surprised that the turnout wasn't big. But to kind of address the question that Shaw proposed, doing IT audit for a lot of different companies, publicly listed companies and private companies, where they have outside shareholders versus just smaller companies, I say the structure of them is so different. So the network structure of them is different. I think a lot of these startups, their network structure is just everything is cloud-based, just so that they can kind of get running and not have to worry about any on-premise servers and upkeep of that. It makes things more easy for them. And I think in regards to data strategy, most of them, I would say, are more concerned with their cybersecurity strategy and outsourcing all of their, network onto cloud, and having everything SaaS-based kind of takes care of a lot of those things. It's only when they start to take ownership of their own kind of network and domains that they might run into their own pitfalls that they create, because now they're responsible for their own securities. And that just ranges based on the size of the companies. So I do really agree with the kind of empathy approach to things. And one of the best communicators I've seen in kind of on my team is someone who, and I've really taken pages from their book on this, but one, it's always important to know when you are assessing a company or auditing a company and you're giving them deficiencies, it's very important to note that, different people will take it differently. There will be people out there that you're trying to, point out a flaw in the system. And this could be with any type of consulting, that you're pointing out something in the hopes that they would take it and improve on it for the next year. And a lot of people take it personally. So it's almost very important to, when you're communicating these things, make it as detached to them as possible, and always formulate every like recommendation of improvement as only that, as this is a recommendation of improvement. This is to make you better next year, instead of I'm pointing out a shortcoming. The other thing is that when you have kind of the companies that are larger and they do have external shareholders and stakeholders, they will be, I think, a little bit more defensive because they don't want the wrong thing to be communicated up the chain of command. And when it is a smaller company, sometimes they just take it and they just kind of shrug everything off, and they're like, okay, you know, these are good notes, and we're still going to kind of operate how we're doing, because for them it kind of depends on how much time and resources they want to spend on changing all of the recommendations. So some of them will have reoccurring deficiencies, and I imagine in a consulting business, or I guess the consulting space, that might be the equivalent of you giving someone the same advice more than once, and they don't immediately implement it. I did have a few questions before we completely run out of time for Benjamin. One, I noticed that I like the kind of like double-headed approach that you come to with companies, and you kind of finding the middle ground of not everyone will want all the perfect advice up front, and you kind of have to give it in waves almost of, you know, fix all these things, then we can go back and fine tune it and tweak it instead of trying to get everything perfect in the beginning. But I wanted to ask if you actually have like a vetting process, or you kind of test the waters with them to see if the companies you're going to work with or the clients you're going to work with, if any of them will be that technical, and maybe a type A company where they might want all the perfect advice up front, and you think that if that's what they want, then it would be adding more value by starting with that versus the same approach of finding a middle ground for every company.
That's a good question. I'd say the companies that I interact with are super varied, like all different domains, sure, and blah blah blah, but like their approach to things is just all over the place. There's companies with no money that want to do things perfectly from the beginning because like that's their sort of ethos. And then, you know, at the other end, companies that have secured VC funding but have a very sort of action orientated mindset and want to just keep doing things and throwing stuff into the wall and see what hits or sticks, so that they can keep moving forward and then, you know, deal with problems as they crop up. I historically as a person have been someone who, not necessarily a planner, because planning isn't necessarily in my nature, but someone who tries to do everything or think everything through perfectly before I take my first step. And it leads to a lot of inaction, and it's something that I don't think is particularly optimal from having the lived experience. And so I am working towards moving towards a more action-oriented mindset where you have an idea, you do the idea, and then you go back and you think about, all right, do I need to do this again? Do I need to fix this? How can this be improved? And so forth, which again has its drawbacks, and which is why I like this sort of in between. But mostly when it comes to actually what the company gets from me, it comes from a discussion, really. Like the thing I try to do with every client that I talk to, first and foremost, is build a relationship. So I usually have if it develops into actual paid work for me, usually I've had 2 or 3 hours worth of phone calls with them prior to that on different, you know, half an hour and hours split out over a period to talk through, you know, what are they trying to achieve? Am I the right person to do it? Discuss like just my ideas and excitement about what is possible. For instance, there was a health tech startup who their vision is personalized medicine, right? That, you know, and everything that can be achieved within that. And basically I was like, that's wonderful. How about we start with a logistic regression or something like that? And so what is right for the different companies really varies. For that health tech, I really can take some of their data, build a model in a notebook on my computer to be a proof of concept that basically they can do something moving towards personalized medicine. And that with that, they can put that in front of more customers to sort of show more value for the product. They can put it in front of funding bodies so that they can get a big wave of funding so they can really develop their product more and then have me develop more stuff for them. And so their real goal is they have very little money at the moment, or they don't have very little money, but they have decent money spread out over a lot of areas. And so they have a small budget for things like this. And so they were like, what can we get which will push our goals forward the most for this amount of money? And so with them, it is kind of hacky. For another company, a marketing agency, who have a very action-oriented mindset, and they're the sort of people who they have an idea and within 4 weeks, they've got a product that they're putting in front of customers. With them, I have discussions, and they're the people who go, well, if you get me prices and if you get me an understanding of what needs doing and how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost me and why it needs to be done, I'll definitely consider, doing things right from the beginning, because they do believe in data science and the power of it and AI, but they don't know how to do it. And so they need that information from me. They need a proper holistic view and a proper sort of rundown of what they'd be investing in and what it'll look like for them. But if they are happy with that, then they would be willing to do it right from the beginning. And so as for what each client gets at the moment, because I am just trying to have a diversity of experience, it's very much a discussion with each one and going and figuring out with them what I think they need based on their vision.
Wow, I love that. And I'm pretty sure that, like, depending on how risk adverse the client might be, that might play into effect as well, because they might not want to instantly, deep dive into one direction versus just dipping their toes and having the plan laid out in front of them. That kind of leads into my next question, and I know we're like running close to time, but you talked about how when things get to a paperwork stage, you've already established kind of 2 to 3 meetings with the client, and so you already built an initial foundational relationship with them, so that, and maybe that's also so that they're a little bit more in tune to when you suggest something. But from the beginning, how do you initiate and how do you promise value to these companies? I mean, do you talk about your history with other companies or consultations? Do you use like a free to fee approach where you might give some surface level advice and just try to build a relationship in the beginning and then later suggest that you can be hired for future consultation? What is your approach strategy?
So this is very much in development and continuously changing. I'm sorry about the train. And to be honest, figuring out a process that's going to create a pipeline of clients coming into me is something I'm still trying to figure out. But in general, what I have in these conversations is I want to learn about their company because that's fascinating to me, and it's a learning. That's my goal with these things. I will have 100 calls with 100 different companies, even if it leads to no work, because I want to learn about what this space looks like and where data fits into it, not just data strategy, but data everything. Because I think that's incredibly valuable information for me as a person and as a business. And so from my side, I'm still getting something out of every one of these calls. And then what we talk about, so I hear about their company, and usually just that and what their idea is and what they're doing is enough to get me inspired, is enough to tread up various technical ideas and applications that can be done. And then I typically like to take a holistic teaching approach, because my assumption, and it's true with most companies, is they have absolutely no idea. And oftentimes they're a little bit scared and so forth, even if they're eager. And so I like to teach them basically what is data science, what can they do with it, from a very holistic approach, and why they would use it. And sometimes in these discussions, it's basically a case of, I'm not the right person for you because you're not at this stage, or I think you'd get more value out of data analytics. At which point I say, can I set you up with some other people I know who are more suited to your needs right now? And you can get back to me in a year or so, or in half a year, and we can have another discussion about where you're going and stuff. And if you ever just want to talk about data, I'm here and such. And in cases where it's more likely that I'm applicable, I talk about, let me give the health tech as an example. They've explained to me what that company does, what sort of data they've got in. I've clarified a few things so I understand it properly, because like they don't have the language necessarily to describe it. At which point I go, well, what's possible here is this, depending on X, Y, and Z. I think we could, this is something that could be done in, 1 or 2 weeks worth of costs or something like that. You need to consider this, that, and the other. And blah, blah, blah. And I basically just, most of the time, what's encouraged people to actually want to work with me is me just being passionate about what it is I do and being excited and teaching them a bit about what I do, not the technical details, but giving them an intuition, let's call it, so that they can A, have some trust in me that I know what I'm talking about, B, feel a bit secure that they're actually going to get what they want or something that is useful to them, and C, also be excited about the possibilities. And in every case, whether it be the marketers or the health tech or this sport analytics software, this software as a service kind of company, it's always been that. It's always been essentially a conversation like I've had in this talk, where I've talked about what I think is important in this world and what we need to prioritize and what we need to watch out for and blah, blah, and how that applies to them is really what's made the difference and made people go, yeah, you're the person that I want to work with, no question whatsoever.
Very nice. I do know that we are over time, so I don't know if Sean wants to cut it or if we want to just go over.
Yeah, no worries. I think we can just end it here. I think this was a super valuable talk. I got a lot of notes here and I extracted a lot out of it, and I think a lot of other people will as well. We're going to share the recording on the YouTube channel as well as in the Discord. And I'm sure if there are any follow-up questions, Ben, people can reach out to you. So Aamir, I'm sure, is going to reach out to you on LinkedIn or something. And we're going to drop all of Ben's links in the YouTube description, and we'll put it on the Discord so you can find him on LinkedIn. You can find his business landing page so you can learn more about Ben and his offerings. So I'll also drop a survey for this workshop in the chat, so you can give some feedback for this workshop overall and to Ben as a speaker. I'm sure he'll appreciate the feedback. And with that, thanks guys for joining. Ben, thank you so much for putting this together. It was an awesome workshop. And later this month, we have another workshop from another Ben, not Benjamen Simon, but Ben Feike from Germany. And he's going to be talking about why he switched from pandas to polars. So I think that'll be a more technical talk, but interesting nonetheless.
Awesome.
All right, guys. Thanks. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.